sending the card, by the way.
Oh, you're welcome.
Happy birthday.
Thank
Happy
you.
birthday, Jan.
But I wanted to just say that I got the biggest kick out of the Confession of 1967's discussion, which is 9.52. Did anyone read that and see there's 3 puns in there? You see the puns?
I have to look it up again, Jan.
Well, are you going to go through those, John? It talks about partaking with him and then the foretaste of the kingdom to come and then the consummation. I mean, all these words about eating, they're great puns in that. I just think of all the ones that all the others were all trying to distinguish from the Catholic Church. The Confession of 1967 is a beautiful rhythmic. I mean, I love the description of the Lord's Supper.
Okay.
Confession of 67. I don't like much of it otherwise, but I sure like this.
Would
Well,
you
and the-
give the reference again, Jan? You said the numbers.
9.52. It was on the list that John gave us.
Oh,
I
okay.
cracked up when I, read it because it's all these puns. Or else I just am reading it incorrectly. So,
Well, if it's a pun for you, that's okay.
consummate anyway. So you'll have to excuse me, but thank you.
Have a good time.
Have fun.
Happy birthday.
Hmm.
Did anyone read the scripture references I sent you?
This is where I failed, John. I just didn't get it done.
Okay.
You can set me in the corner.
I do that, but I don't know how to do that on my screen.
Okay.
Let's do this. Let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Y'all won't, well, I'll do this. So, Bill and Roseanne, why don't you read the Exodus 16, 1 through 3 and 11 through 21 to yourself. And then I'll ask you some questions afterwards, but actually I'll put the questions up on the screen as you read them. Judy and Bruce, will you read and then be ready just to tell us about what it is? Luke 22, 14 to 23. Marla, will you do the Luke 24, 36 to 49?
Okay.
And Kitty, will you do Isaiah 25, 6 through 9? And Jane, you can either sit and wait or I'll give you one of those to read also. I take that means you'll just sit and wait. Okay.
Let's see, what was it again? Luke 24.
36 to 49.
Okay.
Nobody told me what to do with the elements after you serve them and they haven't been used.
Hang on. We're not done with
Okay.
communion yet.
Okay. Did you get the 16? You need this puppy? You read the first part, please.
1 through 3.
Well, it doesn't matter. Read both. Read both. Read both of them. I've already read them. Let's just start.
He'll tell us.
Oh, he'll tell you. Okay.
Who needs a little bit more time to read?
I'm good.
Marla, you ready?
Yeah, whenever you want to go.
So I'm going to ask you to briefly tell us what your passage was about. And then I want you to say who ate the meal, what did they eat, and how does it relate to the Lord's Supper, Communion, Eucharist? Not knowing what to call it. Okay, so the Exodus 16, it was 1 through 3 and 11 through 21. Briefly tell us what that passage is about.
It's about the manna and the quail, and they all ate it.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead, Bill.
who ate it?
Israelites.
Okay, the Israelites ate manna and the quail. How does it relate then to the Lord's Supper?
It was,
God provided it.
there you go.
Okay,
It was provided by the Lord.
okay. And then the Luke 22 passage was verses 14 to 23.
That was the Passover meal that Jesus had with the apostles before he was to be crucified. And they were eating the bread and drinking the cup. And what was the other question?
How does it tie in with communion?
Oh, well, then he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, he took the cup after the meal and said, "This cup is the new covenant by my blood, which is poured out for you."
Yeah, that passage has the easy part. Do this in remembrance of me. Okay, the Luke 24 passage, verses 36 to 49.
Okay, the summary, I guess, is this was when Jesus appeared to his disciples after he had appeared to the walkers on the way to Emmaus. And they were unbelieving. And he said, "Touch me." And then he said, really just very commonly, "Have you anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish. And he ate that in their presence. And then he went on to explain a little bit more of the scriptures and so that they could understand things, I guess, about his resurrection.
Okay,
And as far as, I'm not sure how it relates to communion, because it sounds like he ate the fish and nobody else did. But it was kind of, I think, to prove that he had risen and that he was a real person. He was not a ghost. He says, "I'm not a ghost," because they thought he was at first. So he was kind of proving to them that, okay, you don't, if you don't believe me, here, give me a piece of fish and I'll eat that.
okay. And then didn't he also sends them out from there.
He also, what was that?
He also sends them out
Oh, yeah, okay.
to go out
Yeah.
into to all the nations. So communion is something that we come to the table, but we also are then sent away from the table.
To share, I guess, to share the message, or, yeah, okay. That makes sense.
And then the Isaiah 25 passage, verses 6 through 9. You're muted, Kitty.
That God is going to give us the best. It's a feast of all things, at least in my version it says. I think a feast of choice pieces. And then that
This
they
year.
will be, he will put death forever, and the rebuke of his people he will take away from all the earth. So I think he's going to give us all things and forgive us all things.
Okay. And it's interesting that an Old Testament passage still points us into the future, even after Jesus has come. So while there's not a lot of things we require for communion, there is a few things that should be included. One is listening to the word read, so biblical readings, and then a sermon preached on those. The other aspect that we as Presbyterians say should be involved is confession and forgiveness. And we take that from John's gospel verse in chapter 18. I'm not going to read it, I'm going to tell it to you, but it's in John 18, 15 through 18, 25 through 27, and then 21, 1 through 19. And I sent that to you all, so you should have that reference. But basically, that's Peter's denial.
Oh,
And
okay.
then Jesus coming after the resurrection and eating with the disciples, and then taking Peter off to himself and doing the 3 times, feed my sheep, do you love me, feed my sheep, do you love me, feed my sheep. And so we see that as kind of that, you know, having a meal with Jesus is about forgiveness. And God forgiving us and empowering us then to do what Jesus tells Peter to do, feed my sheep. And so one of the things about Christianity and forgiveness is, you know, when God forgives us, there's a string attached. We might not like to say that, but there is. And that string attached is to share with others that forgiveness message. And then I gave you a basic communion outline service, again, just so you can kind of see some of the order that Presbyterians at least kind of follow. Again, we don't have an order of worship book, so there's nothing that dictates anything about our worship services. So we have a lot of suggestions, but this is kind of the common accepted one. So there's an invitation to the table. And then there's a prayer of thanksgiving, or sometimes it's called the Great Prayer of Thanksgiving, which is usually a prayer that remembers God's salvation acts from beginning through Jesus. And so sometimes it'll be very detailed, and sometimes it might be a sweeping act of or mention of all the times God has provided salvation for the people of God. As in this case, it could be with some parts where the congregation join in or not. After that, there's the breaking of the bread and the pouring of the cup, or what we refer to as the words of institution. And for Presbyterians, the words of institution are reserved for the pastor. And so that's where the decently and in order aspect of communion is for the pastor to say the words of institution, which are those words. This is, you know, basically this is the body of Christ broken for us, and this is the blood of Christ.
What does institution mean in this context?
Instituting it in the aspect of beginning it, starting it, not an institution like a school institution, but to institute something to set it in motion.
Right.
Motion is good.
What what does the Book of Common Worship? I always thought that was kind of the standard, I guess you could say.
Well, it's a standard, but
is
it's
it-
not required.
Okay, okay, it's just kind of, again, suggestions, more or less.
Yeah, most people kind of follow it,
Mhm.
but not everybody. So there's no guarantee that if you go to a Presbyterian church, there's no guarantee that they'll have the same order of worship.
Mhm. I like the Book of Common Worship. I just, didn't know how much it was what used as an authority, as opposed to just
Well,
suggest.
again, common to our Presbyterian way of doing things, there will be some who won't do anything other than that.
Uh-huh.
And then there'll be some who won't do anything that looks like that.
Yeah, I suppose. Aren't we great?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So then after the words of institution, there's communion of the people. So that's either people coming forward or passing the plates, or however it's being distributed. and then we usually do a prayer at the end of the communion service, or the communion portion of service, that usually talks about God blessing us through this meal and through our time together. So I know I skipped through that pretty quickly because I want to get to at least the Book of Order, so we can at least deal with Roseanne's question.
Mhm.
If you read through the Book of Order,
I didn't see it in there.
it starts with the theology of the Lord's Supper, which is a lot of background stuff. It does talk about the Lord's Supper shall be celebrated as a regular part of the service for the Lord's Day. So in other words, the intent there is that it should be enough to where it's common, but it doesn't necessarily have to be every week. But it shouldn't be infrequent enough to where people don't understand why they're doing it.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Again, it talks about things like, we don't do communion for a select few. If we have communion, it's for everybody present. So a wedding or any other type of service, we wouldn't do that. Responsibility for the Lord's Prayer or for the Lord's Supper. Who's responsible for this event happening?
Is it something that the deacons usually prepare for it? And then it's supposed to be under the pastor's tutelage.
Well, as with everything in the Presbyterian Church, the first answer with who is responsible is
Session,
usually the session.
yeah.
So they are the ones who approve when communion is going to be done. Sometimes they do that as a blanket approval, and sometimes they do it year by year. Depending on the congregation, it might be communion by communion if they don't do it very often. Now, who gets the elements ready kind of is a different thing in different congregations. In some congregations, it's deacons. Not every congregation has a board of deacons, though. And so then it kind of comes, well, then who does it fall to? Ultimately, it falls to whoever the session lets it fall to or assigns it to. So I've been in some congregations where there was just 2 or 3 people who just kind of did it. I've been in a congregation where they didn't have deacons, and so each elder took a month and was responsible for getting the communion ready that month. As in First Pres here, their deacons have that responsibility. What else? Then it kind of talks a little bit about the things, the order of it. And then at the end of W-3.0414 is where we're going to find Roseanne's question or answer to her question.
Mhm. Thought I looked at that.
W3.0414, and I'll just read this last paragraph. At the conclusion of the service for the Lord's Day, the bread and cup are to be removed from the table and used or disposed of in a manner approved by the session, in keeping with the Reformed understanding of the sacrament and principles of good stewardship. This
Mhm.
may be accompanied by consuming what remains or returning the elements to the earth.
Well,
So
this,
her question was, what happens to the elements? So in First Press Great Falls, what happens to the elements?
well, I've been told two things, John, when I helped. One was that we could not dump, so to speak, the leftover juice down the drain or the bread into the trash. That we were to take it outside and pour it onto the ground because it was, back to earth. And then I was told, no, you don't have to do that. You can just dump it. So I don't know what we do. Because I've been told two different things.
But don't dump it back into the grape juice.
No,
Yeah.
we didn't
I've
do
been
that.
reprimanded for that.
No, and so I don't know what, I never knew what to do when I had to take care of it.
I don't know if there's a policy set by the session for this congregation or not.
I don't either.
And if there is, how long ago was it said and who remembers it? That's probably a good question.
Yeah.
Right, if it's not written down.
And
Now-
maybe,
Well, I think there's a set of instructions, posted on the wall. I know we have instructions somewhere.
we do.
And I
do-
think it says we can just dump it down the drain. We don't have to
pour it outside or something.
pour it outside. And I'm not sure about the bread.
Well, the bread was
Again-
supposed to be put out for the birds is what
Yeah,
I,
the bread, we usually put it out for the birds, I think.
Again, the question of what we do and has session actually made a decision about that might be two different things.
Right,
right.
That's a good
exactly.
point.
And I
That's
think
a good
the
point.
instructions are not current anymore either. I
Mhm.
don't know.
Well, they're
Course-
not for COVID-19.
No,
Yeah,
that's-
there you go.
yeah, there you
Mhm.
go.
Well, this says you can even eat it. It says this may be accomplished by consuming what remains.
Mm-mm.
So
I
you
was
could
told,
even
no,
take
no.
it home and eat it if you didn't want to throw it out for the
Yeah, I know.
magpies.
No, it
I'll
says that.
tell
in the
you-
book of order.
I'll tell
I
you
was
right
told,
now,
no.
the bread that we use, I usually take home and we finish it at home.
Yeah,
Yeah,
At least
Really?
yeah,
At least
that's
during
what this
COVID-19
says.
time.
When Roseanne asked me about that, I said, well, I hadn't read any place in the Bible that was specific as to Jesus telling them what they should do with the bread, and the
Yeah. You
wine that
won't,
was left over.
you won't.
Probably gave
That's
it
what
to the
I've
birds.
always wondered. Does God really care? I think it's a man-made construct.
Yeah.
In the Episcopal Church, you have the altar guild, which is responsible for setting up and then
Mhm.
cleaning up. And we had a special drain that was called the piscina, that you could pour the wine into because it went directly into the ground as opposed to into the city sewer system. And then we could, any consecrated, we used wafers, went into a special chamber called the tabernacle that, could, and then it was reserved and could be used for home communion or if the priest was going to the hospital or whatever.
Right.
So, but I think that, and one time I forgot to go set up and I said that at an altar guild meeting and one of the ladies said, oh, no, don't ever tell that you forgot. I'm like, God knows. I mean, so I think we get very concerned about these things on a human level. and God knows our hearts and
Yeah.
what we're intending.
I personally, I like the idea of returning it to the earth. That seems a little more respectful maybe than just dumping it down the drain or throwing it in the trash, but that's just a personal feeling. So I don't know. Whatever session decides.
Well, again, depending on your understanding of trash and the drain, those
Yeah.
are returning, those can be seen as returning it to the earth.
That's true. Yeah.
It's not pouring it out on the ground, out on the dirt outside, but
Mm-hmm.
the drain eventually ends up in water someplace.
But it gets mixed in with icky things too.
Well, then
I don't
maybe,
know.
maybe it becomes holy sludge then.
Yeah, it's just, it's just a personal thing. Like, like you say, God knows your heart. So
That's right.
That would be good to have it, if it was blessed, and it would cleanse the water that goes into some of those cities that have had so many problems with contamination. It would be
that
good,
would be nice.
Wouldn't that be
Yeah.
nice?
but,
Yeah.
but it wouldn't happen.
Well,
Not
you
that
never
much.
know, Roseanne.
I don't know. I left the home communion. Yeah, I mean, I left it. It went to a lot of it went to the nursing homes where we would take communion. We usually took communion. At sunrise, we took communion to the people in nursing homes. So,
And that happens a lot. People will do home communions on communion Sundays,
mhm.
Yeah.
take leftover bread from there to go with them. So I have two questions for you to end our discussion on communion. One is from the confessions. So this is from 4.080. And don't read me the answer. But what is the difference between the Lord's Supper and the Papal Mass?
Well, that was
In
a
other words,
division. We don't do
what's
the Papal Mass anymore, do we?
Say that again?
We don't. That is not. I thought I read there that the Papal Mass was no longer. Let me see here.
The Papal Mass is reference to the Catholic service
Yeah.
Yeah.
of Mass,
Well,
which
well,
includes communion. So what's the difference between what we as Presbyterians celebrate when we do communion compared to the Catholics and what they do when they celebrate communion?
Oh,
Is this the transubstantiation difference and
It-
the
Yep.
and the consubstantiation difference? I don't know
And-
if I'm saying that right.
And then the third one that really has no title to it.
Okay.
Yeah, it all ties back into that. So the elements themselves, for Catholics, they become the body and blood of Christ, which also then plays a factor in what you do with them afterwards.
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
When
It
you
would.
actually have the body and blood of Christ in your hands, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
Then there's
You know
the Lutheran view is that Christ is present in and around the elements, but not physically the elements.
Mhm.
And then basically then there's the Reformed understanding that the elements are symbolic of of Christ and his body and blood, and that Christ is present in the people that are gathered together, which then opens up what you do with the elements in a lot different way.
Yeah.
But there's also a bigger difference between the Lord's Supper and then the Papal Mass. And part of that is what we call that object that's at the front of the church.
The altar and the table.
Communion table versus the altar.
Yep. Yep. In a Presbyterian church, we don't have altars.
Right.
We have communion tables.
Which I found out last week, was it? I had no idea before.
And there's a difference because an altar's purpose is sacrifice.
Mhm.
Yeah.
A table's purpose is, for this instance, communion, to gather around, to share a
serving,
meal
yeah.
together.
Yeah.
And so you know, while people might not think about it, there's a huge theological difference in that aspect of communion for our two denominations, and what we call that table up, or what we call, I'm going to say the object again, because for us it is a table, it's not an altar.
You know,
Oh, my-
that ruins that joke that I always used to tell for weddings, John.
What's that?
It's the bride was so nervous about walking down the aisle. The pastor was trying to reassure her. So he said, remember, you're walking down an aisle. You've done that many times when you come to church. You're going up to the altar because you've taken communion there. You know what it's like. You're reassured, you're forgiven. And you sing hymns. You have wonderful hymns that you can sing. So when she was walking down the aisle, the congregation was rather surprised to hear her muttering under her breath, aisle, altar, hymn, aisle, altar, hymn.
Oh,
I
my.
can't tell that joke anymore.
Well, you can still tell it. It just
Yeah.
don't explain it.
It's not a Presbyterian thing.
While before I ask my final question, while Jan did refer to 9.52, it is an important sentence as far, or a paragraph for the Lord's Supper. And while she picked out the puns that are there, the one that jumps out at me from that paragraph is that we are to joyfully eat and drink together.
Hmm.
And how many times have you been in communion where it doesn't feel very joyful?
Yeah, you have to bring your own joy sometimes. You do.
Bring your
I mean,
own
you
joy.
do. Yeah.
So
I
my,
have
my
this- I was just going to say, I think it's been interesting with COVID how sometimes when I'm watching on YouTube and participating, I do feel very connected, and other times it just feels sort of lost. It's been an interesting experience.
Well, there you go. That's a good point.
So my final question, as Presbyterians, can we use wine?
I think you can, but you have to get approval from either Presbytery or Session. I can't remember which one. That's what I was told at one time. Again, I don't know where I hear these things, you know. We wanted to do it at the Glacier Camp, and I had a little container of wine and said, I'll gladly donate that. And I can't remember who said, but they said, no, we can't do it unless we get approval by Session. I think it was Session or Presbytery. So they drove into town and got grape juice and used that instead. That's my experience with it.
Yeah. Well, you do bring up an interesting point. So something like at the camp that is a Presbytery event,
Right.
Presbytery then takes precedence over approval and being in charge of that. A
Okay.
congregational event, it's the session.
Oh, okay.
So you would never have both of them vying for who's in charge.
They wouldn't fight over it. Okay. Some sort
Well,
of a
they
drunken
might, but they
brawl.
shouldn't.
Yeah. Some sort of a drunken brawl over the wine.
That's-
Okay.
that's right.
Okay.
You know, it's
I can
interesting
think of
because
one.
in the Episcopal Church, it was always wine. And so grape juice, even though that's what I grew up with, is still odd to me. But the priest we knew the longest at our Episcopal Church, his wife was an alcoholic and really struggled with that. And I think for her, grape juice would have been better, you know, and I think if we really want to be inclusive, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we can drink water. It doesn't really matter what we're drinking. It's the belief, it's the sentiment behind it. And so I think grape juice is fine.
And I've been told that too, Kitty, that Presbyterians don't use the wine because of the alcoholic potential there for alcoholics too, you know.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
I liked the story Chuck told us about during Prohibition. It was a Presbyterian whose last name was Welch and said we should use grape
Oh.
juice.
I hadn't heard that. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Again, for a congregation, it's up to the session, but as Presbyterians, we can use wine. Most congregations, if they use wine, also make sure they have grape juice available because of
Right.
what we've just talked about.
Right.
And so I've never seen
Sometimes they put the wine in the inner circle. Sometimes they put the wine in the inner circle.
yeah, however
I've
you
seen
do
that
it,
before.
you just need to make sure you identify what's grape juice and
Yeah.
what's
And
what's
see, to me, that sort of defeats the idea of communion, of we're all partaking of the same. And again, I mean, and that's kind of weird
There you go.
considering what I just said about it doesn't matter what we drink, but I think let's all do the same thing.
I've
Yeah,
been to
well, it's
some,
sort of like the gluten and gluten-free too, I suppose. You know.
there's a lot more things now that we have to be concerned about than we used to be. I've been actually to a Lutheran church that has used both.
Really?
That had your choice, yeah, yeah. So I'm going to leave you with two stories. Well, any thoughts or questions on communion before we kind of wrap up here?
Good, thank you.
I guess I'm not clear on when is it confirmation? I mean, when does the Presbyterian Church say, come on, I mean, is it come on up, whatever age you are?
Yeah, again, the only official requirement we have is that you're baptized. And so from that aspect, at whatever age you're baptized, you're then welcome at the table.
Hmm.
So for children, we leave it up to the parents to make up that decision.
Mhm.
So if a parent were to say, "Well, they're fine right now," then we'd say, okay, as a denomination. Now, again, each congregation can set more limits on that,
Mhm.
but then you're probably going to get questions about limits. And so hopefully the session makes that with an informed discussion and ready to defend that if they have to, and not leave the poor pastor out there on his own to justify what the session has said needs to be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my two stories are this. Went to seminary with there was an Episcopal gal there that was in my class, and they do things a little different. So she could actually do communion before we Presbyterians could. So she's doing her first communion, and as Kitty can probably testify, at the end of communion, they drink the goblet gone.
Finish it off.
Yeah, she had never drunk in her life. So here she is finishing this goblet. She said she could barely stand for the rest of the service,
Oh my.
and having to remember what to say and all of that. So that was kind of funny. The other story I'm going to tell you is a tie-in between baptism and communion. So a colleague of mine many, many years ago was on a trip to Europe and Russia specifically, learning about the Russian Orthodox Church. And they happened to be there at Easter time for the Eastern Orthodox Church at that time of year. So they're at this baptismal service because they baptize on Easter morning once a year, and they're baptizing a baby. And so, to start with, they're doing all this thing. And of course, they have this big bowl, and it's like winter time still, so it's cold water. And so they strip the baby down, and as the priest is saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son. Well, each one of those, he dunks the baby under the water and pulls it back out. And so he does that 3 times. And of course, the baby's howling at this point. And so he leans over to his Russian host or hostess, and he says, now just picture a Russian grandma. And that's who this lady looked like. So he leans over and he says, you know, I don't understand. In the United States, we would do anything and everything to not have the baby crying. And yet here the baby's just howling. And so she says in her thick Russian accent that, oh, no, if at this point, if the baby weren't crying, the priest would pinch it to
Oh
make
my
it
God.
cry. Which again, you know, he's like, what? But then she goes on to talk about, how do you know a healthy baby is born?
They
They
cry.
cry.
They cry.
Yeah.
And if baptism is representative of birth into
Right.
the life of Christ, why would you not let something like that happen?
You'd
Mhm.
want the baby to cry, I guess.
So immediately after that, then the priest takes this spoonful of a mixture of wine and bread and spoon feeds it to the baby. And again, he's just like, what is going on? And of course, he goes into this, you know, for most of us in the United States, you know, we wait for them to grow up and try to, you know, tell us what it means and all of this stuff. And she says, well, we don't expect the baby to explain to the mother what milk is.
Mm-hmm.
We just feed them because it's good for them and they need it. And so the illustration there is communion is the food to help people nourish, whether they understand it or not.
Mhm.
And then we call these things sacraments, which means mystery. And ultimately, we don't understand them because they are mysteries that God gives us to do.
Right.
And so ultimately, we have to fall back on faith as to, okay, God is telling us to remember in this act or to welcome in this act. And we might not understand what that means, but our faith tells us to do it.
Okay.
That's
So,
good. That's
This-
good.
This going back to the Russian story though, then if an adult was baptized, would they expect him to cry?
you know, he didn't ask that and we didn't ask that, but it would be interesting to see, you know, okay,
Yeah,
I'm gonna pinch you in the butt now until you cry.
yeah, right, yeah. I mean, that could be, well,
Oh,
whatever.
no.
I don't want to
Oh,
go there,
no.
so that's okay.
Yeah, you know,
Oh, no. Then we have harassment with the women.
Right,
Whoa.
yeah, we'll just assume that there's some solution for that, but we don't know what it is.
yeah, and that's okay.
That's a good story.
Yeah, it is. They both were.
So next week we'll look at mission. So in the Book of Order and Book of Confessions, look up mission in the index and just kind of read a few of the entries there and
Okay.
kind of get a feel for a couple of them and maybe what jumps out at you. And but we'll move into mission and what mission is and how that affects us as Presbyterians.
Mhm.
So, okay, a little longer than normal tonight, but I wanted to get done with the sacraments so we didn't drag it into a third week, but
Okay. It was good. It's
I,
Any-
I enjoy this though. I enjoy the conversation, so it's fine with me.
good. Good. And I forgot to start recording, so
Uh-oh.
I recorded when Jan left, but you know, I'll still post it and we'll see who says anything about it. Who would like to close us in prayer?
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for sharing faith and wisdom and laughter. Thank you for knowledge and friends and the safety of being at home and the technology that allows us to still gather and to be together and learn about your hopes for humanity. The next couple of weeks in this country are going to be interesting. I pray for peace and calm and wisdom again as we all make decisions that will affect our future. I thank you for John and his care of our congregation and community. And I hope that you will continue to guide us as we continue to learn your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Thank you.
Yeah.
I do have one other question. When we first set this class up, the idea was when midweek started, we'd do a hybrid class if people wanted to attend in person. Are any of you interested in that, or should we just kind of forget that and do Zoom?
The Zoom is working for us.
Yeah,
isn't it?
this works for me and Rosie.
Yeah.
You know, I don't like going out at night much anymore, so the Zoom works fine for me. I like meeting in person, but Zoom works fine.
Mhm.
I like it in theory, but most Wednesdays I have my grandsons and I just don't want to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm going to take that part out of the announcement then, because we're far enough into it that I think whoever's going to join us is joining us, and I don't see us using that aspect
Yeah.
for the rest of this class. So, okay, I didn't want to take it out and then have you say, why aren't we starting to meet in person?
Mhm.
So, okay, you all have a good evening.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Okay,
Mhm.
thank you,
Tomorrow.
John.
Okay,